Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohrer, and here on Stand in the Gap, Isaac Crockett and I tackle the most important issues affecting you, the American citizen, the American family, the American governmental system, and the American church. And on this program, we don't just talk around issues, we don't waste time trying to shape symptoms. We try to go to the root problem. And through the four-phase lens of a biblical worldview which recognizes four essential truths. One, there is God. Two, there was a creation and act of God. And third, there was a fall where sin entered the world precipitated by the devil. But lastly, there is redemption secured by Jesus Christ. Here we address the most pressing cultural issues of the day from a biblical and constitutional perspective, and we follow a simple approach capable of solving any problem facing our nation or any nation by applying a deliberate, biblically based diagnostic process consisting of four clarifying questions. What does the Bible say, either in command or by principle? What does the Constitution guarantee or prescribe? What does freedom require of you and me? And what does justice demand from civil authority? So if you want to know the truth, if you want to know what God thinks, if you want to make sense of all the nonsense around us, stay with us for the next 30 minutes as together we walk through the darkness of today's seemingly unsolvable dilemmas into the light and the freedom of moral truth. Now, the focus of today's program will revolve around the thorny issue of racial division and racism in America. We're going to talk about why the media and so many political figures insist on trying to create division by fixating on racial differences and racial inequalities, whether real or perceived. And without question, many in our nation are paranoid and with some even being obsessed with what's regularly referred to as racism. And to a large degree, most are afraid that at some point somebody's going to label them as racist. Now, in fact, a 2017 poll conducted by Pew Research highlights these facts and these concerns. According to this Pew Research, since 2015, the increase in perceptions of racism as a big problem, as they defined it, has been almost entirely among Democrats, making an already wide partisan gap in these attitudes even larger. Now, still according to Pew, overall, 58% of Americans say racism is a quote-unquote big problem in our society, end quote, while 29% say it is somewhat of a problem. Now, 2 years ago, 50% of the public viewed racism as a major problem for society, and in 2011, just 28% did so. So the problem is real. We know it. Statistics and research prove it. But should it be this way? And what's the definition of racism anyways? What's its cause? How did we get where we are, and can we get out of this morass of division and animosity? Well, I'll tell you up front that the answer is a most definite yes, there is a way out. And we're going to deal with this issue today on Stand in the Gap. Our theme for today, successfully bridging the racial divide. Joining Isaac Crockett and me today to discuss this issue will be Dr. Joseph Green, businessman and head pastor of Antioch Assembly in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and founder of the 2019 movement. Now, according to 2017 Pew Research report, since 2009, the first year of Barack Obama's presidency, growing numbers of both Democrats and Republicans have seen racism as a big problem. For Democrats, that increase was almost doubled from 32% to 58%, and more than doubled in that same period for Republicans from 18 to 40. So just before Isaac Crockett and I talk with Dr. Joseph Green, let's watch a very short clip from former President Obama as he talked about racism in America and how he said in this presentation that racism, in effect, was impossible to solve because it's a part of Americans' DNA.
What is also true is that the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, discrimination in almost every institution of our lives, that casts a long shadow. And that's still part of our DNA. That's passed on. We're not cured of it.
Racism.
We are not cured of.
Well, stay with us, and we'll be right back after this announcement.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, and a growing network of statewide chapters leading the conversation in cities, small towns, and state capitals. Educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Hello and welcome back to Stand in the Gap today. I'm Sam Rohrer. I'm accompanied today by Pastor Isaac Crockett to my left, and our special guest today, Dr. Joseph Green. He is a businessman. He is head pastor of Antioch Assembly in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and he's also founder of a new movement called the 2019 Movement. And with that, I'd like to welcome you. I'm going to call you Joe, okay?
Sure.
All right.
No problem.
Even though you're Joseph, we're going to call you Joe just to keep it shorter.
Yeah, no problem.
We're really glad that you're with us on this issue today. You and I have known each other for some years. You and Isaac and I have gotten to know each other well. And we couldn't think of anybody better to help walk us through this thorny issue of racism in America. If I can, I'd like to always define the terms up front, and I know you do too.
Yes.
Because we often say whoever defines the terms controls the narrative, and so many times on cultural issues in America, we allow somebody else to define the term. So let me define, if I could, racism. This is just something, if people were to Google, they would get this. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now, if I look at that, I'd say there's probably a lot of good things in there that may be true. However, I'm not so sure that racism is defined. I think we probably ought to define prejudice and bias because they're kind of wrapped in. So I want to go to you right off. Pastor Joe Green, businessman, head pastor. How do you define racism? So let's get our definition laid out here today as we enter into this program.
Okay, so I think that that's an important differentiation to make, because sometimes we clump everything into racism when a lot of it isn't. So racism is what you described it as, but I also like to add it's institutional and it is systematic. So because it's institutional and systematic, like we had slavery in America, there were laws on the books that defined that. And then there were Jim Crow laws and what was called the Negro Code. So that's racism. Now, prejudice and bias, prejudice is just a preconceived notion towards someone, and then bias is how I treat them based on my preconceived notions towards them. So racism is something that we can measure and that's tangible, as opposed to the other two that may or may not be necessary.
All right, so I'm just going to, before Isaac picks up with a series of questions here, is it fair, though, to treat this general topic of racism, we must include bias as part of our thinking and prejudice as part of our thinking, but you're differentiating those two, which may be more attitudinal, perhaps?
Yes.
With your saying that racism, properly understood, actually has some kind of law associated to it or some kind of institutional enforcement.
Laws or policies or something like that. Like I said, there were actually laws on the books that separated people based on their race and treated one group over another because of the race.
Joe, how big of an issue is this right now? What would the scope of this be? Could you maybe let us know who is affected by this, who is not? Are there groups of people say, well, this doesn't really affect me in our country, in our culture? What's the scope?
Yes, it is actually a real problem. And when we look at the systematic racism, so I've done some work with the criminal justice reform, And the Department of Justice has acknowledged the fact that there are differences in how people of color have gotten sentenced or targeted. Racial profiling has been used by many police forces, so that's a policy that's actually in effect, which is systematic, which would meet the requirement or the definition of racism.
So this is pretty broad then. What about the history of it? As Americans, a lot of times we focus on, racism in America, obviously as President Obama was doing in that clip. But historically, racism, is this just an American thing? Is it just a newer thing? How do we look at it that way?
Absolutely not. When we understand racism takes place, as a matter of fact, the transatlantic slave trade, which we addressed in the 2019 movement, wasn't just towards North America. Great Britain had a big thing with slavery, and also South America, they had slaves that was transported. But if you look at any nation and any continent in the world, there are forms of racism. So, for instance, in Africa, you had the Hutus and the Tutsis, that they were all the same, they were all from the same nation and the same skin color, but yet there was a differentiation systematically that separated them. If you go to England, we were talking about it off camera, even Northern Europeans versus Southern Europeans. You had the Aryans versus like the Italians and the Spanish people, that there were actual things in place that treated them differently than others. So it's not a U.S. thing, it's not a black and white thing. I would say it's a human thing, that we all kind of gravitate towards the people that are more familiar to us than others.
So Joe, that is what Isaac is asking about the historical. Many people in America are made to feel like we are innately guilty because we are Americans. Actually, the president in that clip really kind of referred to it in that way. Americans have racism built into their DNA. And what you're saying is that we have to back up a little bit and say, wait a minute. Yes. It may be here, it may be evidenced in a number of ways, but it's not just here. It's a human condition, which
right.
You just said,
absolutely,
around the world. All right, that's a little bit of an historical, and I know we could go a lot deeper, but let's go here to the spiritual perspective, because I know that you feel strongly about that, and we're going to address this issue from a spiritual perspective. But look at how does it fit within the church? I mean, the church should be the place from which there is clarity on this issue, yes. But I'm not so sure there always is.
I agree with you, and I think part of the thing that we have to do as the church is we have to be the forerunners in this issue, because we understand that God's plan from the very beginning was that every race, every nation in the world would be united as one, and more specifically in Christ. And so, and when you look at heaven, I think it's Revelation 7, it says every tribe, every tongue, they come together and they worship the Lamb. If you look at the book of Acts chapter 2, it says that every nation under heaven was represented on the day of Pentecost. And so God's intention from the beginning was for mankind to be united as one, not ignoring our diversity of culture and ethnicity, but embracing it and understanding that God is the one ultimately that will bring us all together, because we all came from him. One blood, every nation came from one blood and one person.
Joe, I want to add something here. We were talking before we actually sat down here to this recording. I have friends, and I think we all do, but I have a friend who is a pastor in India. I'm going to use that as an example because here as we're Americans, we're not Indian, but there's a lot of Indians now living here, different country, but it goes to historical part that you are talking. I like to bring together the spiritual here. I asked him, I said, here in India, they have a caste system. That's very Hinduish. That's where the caste system comes from. They have very deep divisions that are there regardless of who they are. But I asked him, do you have racism in India? Well, he says, yeah, in reality, using the broader definition, yeah, there are distinctives. And he said there's lighter in the north and there's darker in the south. And we actually measure each body to some degree based on color and caste. They got more of a problem than we do here. Because we don't have a caste here, right? But I asked him this question. I said, brother, I said, what happens in the church in India? Have the church gotten to the point where believers, where they come now into the church, they may be from a lower caste, a higher caste, they may be a darker color, a lighter color, all the distinctions that they have. I said, have they actually solved that problem? What happens in the church? He said, in the church yet, it hasn't been solved. So I think that we need to lay this thing out. This issue is one that's pervasive. It's around the world, but there is a solution. Now let me transition, if I could, into this. We're talking, and I like to talk in terms of symptoms. Lots of times we talk about issues, but we never get to the root problem. We deal with symptoms, and I think this is one of them. So I came up with a definition. Tell me if you agree with this. Okay. Now this is a little bit different than what I read earlier. But I put this down. This is the root problem of racism. It's the sinful embracing of a prideful or superior attitude resulting from a rejection of God's design for humankind established at creation and recognized in our Constitution that all men are created equal before God and of equal value in His eyes. So I put in the terms prideful, superior attitude, rejection of God's design because He created us equal. Our Constitution recognizes it. But anyways, are you satisfied with that? Is that a good definition?
I think that's a good definition, yes. I like that, and I also would like to add to that that it's not really embracing God's love, because God's love allows us to not be place ourselves above others, but see other people as God sees us as well.
So we're talking now about pride entering into this. It's more than just a natural bias. It's a prejudice based on a feeling of superiority. So Sam, spiritually speaking, and we're with the Pastors Network, we're all preachers and pastors here, where does that root of superiority come from? You were talking about India. My wife was born in Kolkata, India. We recently had a situation where somebody said a snide comment to us out in public because we were together, as if there was this superiority of, hey, we're the same color skin, what's she doing here, kind of a thing. Where does that superiority, where's the root of that coming from?
When I go to the Word of God, Isaac and Joe, I go to the most fundamental element that caused, in our biblical worldview, caused sin to enter the world after creation, and that was the devil. And what was the devil's problem? He was proud. And he said, I want to be like God. And I go to Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16. It says, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto Him. The very first one is a proud look. Then it goes to a lying tongue and so forth. But a proud look. I think Scripture talks a lot about pride. That's one of our greatest downfalls, I believe, as humankind, is that we think that we are just something. But without Christ, we're not really anything.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And God hates it. And then I look there, and I go to the New Testament. In Philippians 2, chapter 8, it talks about Christ, and it says, and being found in fashion as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient unto the death of the cross. God became man, demonstrating humility, the opposite of pride, and He came and died on the cross for the sins of mankind. Redemption, on our biblical worldview, where all people are equal. He died for black and white and yellow and tall and short. It didn't make any difference. God Himself did that. So, Isaac, to answer your question, I think the real root of racism and prejudice and bitterness is that we've rejected God's plan and say, hey, we're better than so-and-so. In fact, we're nothing without Christ. And so anyway, is that okay for right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great definition, because the core of all that is pride. Yes.
Well, fortunately, ladies and gentlemen, the Bible speaks a lot about these issues, and we're talking about the matter of race right now, but successfully addressing or bridging the racial divide. And ultimately, as we just talked about, it really occurs at the foot of the cross. It occurs with an understanding of who Jesus Christ is and the plan of redemption that God laid out from the beginning of the world. And that is where we really, truly must view all of ourselves. We are needy of God's redemption through Jesus Christ. But that's also the healing, and that's how we can have clarity on this issue. So stay with us. When we come back, we're going to continue into the next section with our special guest, Joe Green. And he's going to give us just a little bit of his testimony and how he became involved in this movement called the 2019 movement.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap, and we've been talking today about bridging the at least we could say, so-called racial divide. We're here today, Sam and myself are with our good friend Joe, Pastor Joe Green, and we've been talking, Joe, you've already mentioned that we are one blood, that Christ created us unified in Him. We are united to God through Jesus Christ. Sam and Joe, you have both brought up the superiority complex, I guess, that causes prejudice, bias, that really comes from a heart of pride that goes all the way back to the very beginning. And so as we talk about that, we're looking at the cross, at Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and life for everything, including racial reconciliation. I would just like to go back to you, Joe, and just ask you to let us know how you got involved with this. We're about to hear about your 2019 movement. You, of course, you speak to law enforcement and churches and all kinds of groups all over about this, as well as your church. Has it always been that way in your life? Has this always been your understanding, or was there things that brought this to grow for you, and maybe experiences that you went through that kind of help you relate to the situation we've been talking about?
Well, yes. A little bit of all that. So just a little bit about myself. I was raised, my grandfather was from the Deep South, and he would always share with me stories about some of the prejudice and the racism that he experienced. But he also always taught me not to allow it to take root in my soul, because that bitterness that grows root inside of us, as the Bible tells us, actually damages us more than the people that we're angry at. So I've always been aware of that. I had a stepfather who was a Black Panther in the 60s. He told me about some of the struggles that they went through. But again, I never allowed it to, I never embraced it as something that was a part of my being. I have experienced racism like most people of color in America. One of the stories I like to share is one of my best friends, when we grew up together, he graduated as an electrical engineer. His parents had money, and for a graduation gift, they bought him a really nice BMW. And every time we went out, he would get pulled over. He would get racially profiled because he had a very expensive car, and we were young African-American males. It was part of what they called the war on drugs. And a lot of times they would tell us, get out of the car with your hands so we can see them and everything, even though we weren't doing anything wrong. So racism is very real, and it's not a thing that we're talking about something that happened necessarily 150 years ago, but for many people of color, it happened now. So that was one of the things that was so important to me, because I understood that we can do something about racism. There are laws, there are, the civil rights, the affirmative action laws, there are hate crimes legislation that actually helps to address certain aspects of racism. But I also understand that the prejudice and the bias that people experience normally comes from us not being educated or not having compassion, or we may be in a situation, Isaac, that I'm angry at you because of a white person that did something to me, so I take it out on you, and so now you lash back at me and you say, well, black people are really mean, but that's based on our experience. So I always felt like if you see a problem, either you're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And so being a man of God, I decided that I wanted to be proactive in helping to help facilitate what God has meant for us to be in heaven, because at some point in time we got to get it right.
Well, we will get it right.
We will get it right one way or another, either this side or the other side.
Yeah, we're struggling on this side. But when we stand before the Lord, all of that's going to be totally disappeared.
Absolutely.
Joe, I'm really glad we've talked about this issue, and you've shared some of what you just shared here with me in the past. In America, we often think that the racism is black and white. It seems what it's made out to be, but it could be Asian and black, like we talked about historically. So I want to make sure we're saying that this is, we may be seeing black and white when people look at us right now, but it's much broader than that. But really, when it comes down to it, as white pastors, or not just white people generally, depending where they are, we don't really know how to deal with it, which is why I'm so glad that you have felt led of the Lord to seek reconciliation and to take a lead on helping to do what we all ought to be doing, but sometimes I think we don't always know how to do it. So to that degree, tell us a little bit about the 2019 movement. What gave rise to it? Why'd you call it 2019 movement? Let's just start there. Why'd you call it the 2019 movement? That's next year.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, so what is it?
Well, I looked at the biblical pattern, and throughout the Bible, in the book of Exodus, you had Israel was in Egypt for 400 years. God says, I'm going to deliver you. And right before that happened, there was an attack on the males, attack on the babies. There was a breakdown of the family, and there was economic depression. And then I looked from the Old to the New Testament when Jesus, the Messiah, was coming. Same thing happened, attack on the males, attack on the babies. There was a breakdown of the family, economic oppression. And so as I began to see the issues that were really plaguing us in America, in the black community especially, there's attack on the males, attack on the babies through abortion, mass incarceration, and these type of things. And I felt like I heard the Spirit of the Lord say, could it be that this is a generation that I'm bringing together, that we help to deal with this issue, not just based on just black people getting it together, but how do we reconcile, because it's in all of our best interest that all of us succeed, especially those who are part of the body of Christ. And so we're about racial reconciliation. We're about looking at things from a historical standpoint. We've developed what's called a manifesto, which is pro-life, pro-God, pro-family, pro-reconciliation. And so we put all these components together, believing that God's going to bless this effort and help us to solve this critical issue that we talk about as far as racism in America.
I'm excited to hear about this, Joe. And we're going to, ladies and gentlemen, we are actually going to hear more about this. And can you stay with us to the next broadcast?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we're not done yet, ladies and gentlemen. We have to deal with the issue of the cause in our problem cause solution. How did we get here? Who is to blame? Who's to take credit for where we got? And where is the solution? We're going to lay that out. 2019 movement, Brother Joe's talking about here, will be a part of it, but we're going to take you to the Word of God, because therein, I'll tell you right up front, that is where the answers are found. If we're willing to go there, we will deal with this issue of racism and bias and prejudice biblically. After all, that's the only real way to fix any problem.